Okay, so let's take our first few steps into learning about one-to-many relationships. So again, we're dealing with the video sharing site case. And there's a little bit of language here for it, but we'll kind of skip over that because we've already discussed it briefly. I will provide this document on Blackboard for you in the content categories under cases. But just a quick look, we're looking at two entities. We have accounts for the users. When they register, they'll need an account. And for each account, for the time being, we are tracking first name, last name, email, password, registration date, and whether or not their account is currently active. For videos, ID, just like every other entity. And for each video, we're going to track the title, what date it was posted, how long it is, how many times it got a thumbs up and a thumbs down, and how much ad revenue it's created. And we'll kind of work around the details because a lot of this stuff would be filled in by an application. So we'll just kind of have it there and we'll work with it as is. I've laid out some table designs for these two tables. Each table has an ID, which is an integer field, is marked as an identity field, and is the primary key for this table. So the same thing here on the video table. All right. We've also got each of the column names that we mentioned in the entity model, and I've kind of picked out a good data type for each of them. You may notice there's a lot more going on in the constraints column. We're going to talk briefly about each of these constraints in class this week, so I'm not going to go into detail about them, but suffice it to say that this constraint that says not null is going to make it so that if you try to insert data into this record and you do not provide a first name, or you try to provide null as the value for first name, that you'll get an error, so you won't be able to insert data that way or update it for that matter. This default here causes the field to automatically get updated with the current timestamp. This default here causes the record to get automatically updated with the current timestamp. You can use any default, but we'll use current timestamp for the registration date, and that way we don't have to fill in the registration date manually. We can just create the record and let the database automatically add the current time to it. The active column, for example, we've defaulted to 1 because if we're going to create a brand new account, there's a good chance that it's going to be active right away and a very small chance that it'll be inactive right away. And then you'll see a couple more not nulls and defaults throughout here. Probably the thing that's most of note in this table design is that even though we've got this rule here that all columns in a particular entity start with the same prefix, suddenly we've got this one here that's got a different prefix. And if we look a little bit closer, we'll notice that the foreign key here has the same column name as the primary key in the account table. Then we'll talk about what that all means, why we do things that way. But in short, this here, this AC ID in the video table is tagging each video with the account to which it belongs. And we use the ID field rather than the account name, last name, email, password, and whatever, because that way we have one small consistent and reliable piece of information to connect a child table or a child record to a parent record. Notice that it's an integer data type because our account ID in the parent table is an integer data type, so the data types must match. On the other hand, it is necessary for us to have an identity specification on the primary key, but it's also just as necessary to not have the identity specification on a foreign key because you can only have it on one field, and we don't want to automatically generate the IDs for our foreign key field. In fact, we specifically want to indicate the correct number for the related key from the other table here. We're also going to make sure this is not null because we don't want to have what are called orphan records or videos that don't have accounts that own them. And we're marking it as a foreign key, and that's the constraint that the database puts on our table to make sure that we're adding data that actually belongs here. So I know that was a lot, and we're going to go into getting to the code, but first I just want to take one step backwards, and that is to look at this account and video table diagram. This is called a database diagram. We've made entity models. These squares individually here, this square and this square, are called entity models. But when we put them together and we indicate their relationship to each other, so when we do that and then we add in this kind of relationship indicator, we then are beginning to make a full database diagram, and that's what we're referring to it as now, a database diagram. The industry term for it is entity relationship diagram, and we're using a very simple notation in our class. We're using something called crow's foot notation, and so we'll always use the same symbol. We may use a one-to-one relationship indicator where it's a straight line, and we'll talk about that when that comes along. But for most of our relationships, because most relationships are like this, we'll have a parent and child relationship. You'll notice that there's a direction to the way that this crow's foot points. There's one spoke on the left hand side and three spokes, or you can just call it many spokes, on the right hand side. So the foot side here represents the many side of the relationship, and the pointed side represents the one side of the relationship. So this is a one to many relationship. And what that means is that for one account record, there can be many video records. And because of the way this relationship works, it can be one account record with zero or many video records by default. So we don't have to have a video record there for the account record to exist. But every time we create a video, we have to have a related account record. The account table is considered the parent table in this relationship, the one side of our one-to-many relationship, and the video table is considered to be the child side of that relationship. Our many side is the child side. So looking at the video table, this being the child table and the many table, you'll notice that down here on the video table is where we put the foreign key. And we'll do a few examples in class to show why we want that foreign key in that position and not elsewhere. But suffice it to say that this is absolutely necessary in a one-to-many relationship to have the foreign key on the child table. It cannot work if you try to put it on the parent table. Now let's go into code.